There are those that love Seiko, and there are those that love to hate on Seiko. And today we're going to do a little bit of both at the same time. As this watch right here, I think really represents the current state of Seiko when it comes to affordable watches, and more so than any other Seiko I've currently looked at, which includes both the good and the bad. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to talk about the special edition Save the Ocean Antarctica Monster. And before we really dive into this one, I do want to make one thing very clear, because by the end of this video, you may have the impression that I really don't like this one. But to be honest, I absolutely love this watch. It has quickly and easily become one of my favorites. And more to the point, if I ever want to or need to really slim down my collection, out of all the Seiko divers I have, or Seiko homage divers I have, this would be the last one standing. Now that said, let's get to it. So the Antarctica is basically a special edition Generation 4 monster, and as such it's going to have the same specs as well as the same case as any other Gen 4 monster. With that, we are looking at a case that's 42mm wide with a lug-to-lug of 48. And as far as divers go these days, I would say that sits in the mid-range. And as far as Seiko divers go, I think this is the closest you're going to get to the now defunct SKX when it comes to size. Thickness-wise, you're looking at 13.4mm, and that does go from the closed case back to the very outer rim of the bezel, as that outer rim sits just slightly above the crystal. Now, bear in mind that that doesn't include the Cyclops, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, on the wrist, the monster feels a little flat, at least compared to other divers I've worn, which I've also found true of any other monster I've worn on my 7¼ inch wrist. Flat is really the best way I can think to describe it. And if I did have to assign any blame, I think it is due to these short stubby lugs, which don't slope down a lot and wind up sitting just slightly above the case back. So the watch winds up sitting above your wrist rather than hugging it. Now, don't get me wrong here, it's not bad. This is still a watch you can comfortably wear throughout the day, and over the last few months I have done just that. It's just that it doesn't wear as good as some other divers I've worn. So this isn't one I would say fits like a glove. Now, rounding out the specs, you're looking at a 22mm lug width and a 200 meters diver's rating. So this is an ISO rated diver for those that care. Seiko also threw in a 4R36 movement, as well as a good chunk of Seiko Lume bright on the dial. The case here is a straight up monster, as you would expect. It's one of the more interesting divers that Seiko has ever designed. Like the legendary Tuna, the monster is a case design that puts a lot of emphasis on its matching steel bezel. However, unlike the Tuna, the monster is a little bit smaller, and it's usually paired with a more aggressive dial design. Now, over the years, the dial design has been toned down. Initially, that monster nickname was given to it because the indices resembled teeth. So when you stared down at the first couple of generations, it really looked like you were staring down the gullet of something that was about to take a bite out of you. But while the dial has evolved, the case has mostly remained the same, with a primarily brushed finish that does have these very short stubby lugs, which also winds up acting as a shroud for the bezel at the top and bottom of the case. The only polished sections on the case are on the sidewalls, where it has these matching cutouts that line up perfectly with a similar cutout on the bezel. And I think that, combined with the shroud, really gives the case and the bezel a more cohesive look than a lot of other divers out there. In the world of Seiko divers, the monster is legendary, but it doesn't quite have the following as the Tunas and the Turtles. The design is a bit divisive. Some people are completely turned off by it, while others like myself really embrace the cool uniqueness and somewhat aggressive look. Now, looking to the right, at about the 345-ish position, we have a screwed down crown coming out of that lower shroud, with a rather functional yet minimal look. The crown is just big enough to grab and unscrew, yet subtle enough that it doesn't distract from the bezel and the dial. And just like any other Seiko at this price, the crown is disappointingly not signed. Some people care and others completely don't, but it is something that Seiko typically doesn't do. And yes, that is Hardlex, and yes, that is a giant candy bar sitting on top of the Hardlex. So let's talk about both really quickly. As for the Hardlex, well, when it comes to Seiko affordable divers, and make no mistake, even with the price tag, this is still basically a Seiko affordable diver, It's all about Hardlex. Whether or not that's appropriate is an entirely other discussion. And at this price, it really should be sapphire. I don't think anyone's really going to argue against that. So this is an issue, but I think it's more of an issue when it comes to value, and we'll talk about that near the end. The candy bar, on the other hand, is something that is a bit divisive. Now, on the original monsters, it didn't have any sort of Cyclops, but this was something that was introduced in the 3rd gen, and they've just kept up with it. When it comes to Cyclopses, some people just absolutely hate them, but I'm more rather ambivalent against it. I don't think anyone's ever looked at a Cyclops and thought that it actually looked good with the design, as it always just disrupts the flow. But on the other hand, I don't think anyone could really argue, and especially as you're getting older, that a Cyclops isn't useful. With this one, the candy bar was never really an issue. It never bothered me while I was wearing it. And a few times, I was actually glad it was there. Now, for some people, this is reason number 1 not to get this watch. But for me, it just sort of is what it is. On the rear, you have a closed case back complete with all the particulars, as well as a center polish section with the design. Really, there's not much to say here. It's pretty standard for Seiko's Pro Spec watches. Back to the front, we have the bezel, and let's talk about it just a little bit more, as it is simultaneously one of the more difficult and easiest bezels I've ever had to turn. Because the shroud is at the 12 and the 6, it is very hard to get a grip at those positions. But if you try to grab the bezel from the sides, it is extremely easy. Not only is there a lot of surface area, but those scalped cutouts on the bezel are just perfect for your fingertips. The action itself is also very Seiko-like. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and maybe just a hint of backplay. But it is with this bezel where we run into the first QC issue. And as a lot of Seiko fans out there might have guessed, it is because the bezel isn't quite lined up. And unfortunately, this is rather common with Seiko these days, as it just seems to be a plague on their affordable watches. Not every Seiko out there is going to have this issue, but it is frequently reported. Now, we reviewers often like to joke about this, like the only way to tell a real Seiko from a fake is if something is misaligned. But most of the time we do that because there's nothing else we can really do, and really this isn't funny. And especially on a limited or special edition watch where you are going to pay a little more. And that's not to say that it's okay on a regular monster, but on something like this, you think Seiko would pay a little bit more attention to it. That they'd be a little more careful with the build or the QC after the fact. But obviously they don't. And as long as we are talking about issues, let's go right ahead and start talking about the bracelet. In terms of quality, you're looking at about the same type you would see on any other affordable Seiko diver. So it has solid end links, solid links secured with push pins, and a pressed clasp, which is also complete with Seiko's kind of funky diver's extension hinge that I don't think a lot of people even know exists, let alone use. The design of the bracelet is a little bit different than other Seikos, but it is one that has been used on monsters before, where it's a single brush link that has a slightly recessed polished section, which then connects to the other link. It's a pretty cool and interesting design, and not one you're going to see on a lot of other watches. And one thing I like is how the polished sections just subconsciously guide your eyes towards the case and dial. Although the downside is that those polished sections are just fingerprint magnets. No matter what you do, there always seems to be smudges on them, and since they're recessed, they are a little harder to clean. But otherwise, it's a good design and an okay bracelet, which I think you can say about a lot of Seikos. But let's talk about the issues here, and there are two. The first of which is the pressed clasp. Now, functionally, there is nothing wrong with it. But when you look at other areas of the market at this price range, it really should have a milled clasp. And that includes regular monsters, not just a special edition. But once again, this is something that is common with Seikos at this price. However, the other issue is the big one, and I personally think it is unacceptable. Looking at the end links, the fit here just flat out sucks. They are extremely sloppy. Not only is there a bit of a gap, but just a little bit of pressure and it easily wiggles back and forth, as well as side to side. Now, I've seen some sloppy end links before, but never on a Pro Spec diver. So I don't know what's going on here. And that's not even bringing up how bad the finish is on the inside of the lugs. I know this is something you typically don't see, but this is nasty. Now, I know earlier generation monsters never had a fitted end link before, so maybe there's a reason to that with this case design. And if that is the case, they never should have introduced them on the Generation 4. I know fitted end links are always something people want, but it's better not to have them than to have one that sucks. Now, despite that, the bracelet is still very usable, but it's not really one that you fall in love with. And personally, I've wound up spending more time with this watch on a silicone strap, as not only does it feel more comfortable in the summer heat, but I think it looks better too. Anyway, now that we've talked about the negatives, let's move on and talk about the positives, with this very stunning and unique dial. The basic idea behind this one is that the dial resembles a snow-covered surface of a glacier. So not only is it textured to have that effect, but it also has a bit of a fume gradient, where the very center of the dial starts out as a very light pale blue, which then turns to a dark blue-gray at the very outer edges. And that's right before it gets to a dark blue chapter ring, which, like any other monster, winds up sitting right on top of the dial, and has these cutouts that enable the applied indices to fit snugly inside. The chapter ring is one of my favorite features of the monster, and it's the reason I decided to get the Antarctica version of it rather than the baby tuna, as I think it gives the design a much more cohesive feel, with the indices acting as a literal bridge between the dial and the chapter ring. Now, one of the other QC issues people have had is with a misaligned chapter ring. Here, I think it looks okay. If anything, it might be a hair off, but if it is, it's not anywhere near as noticeable as the bezel. The indices used are the same as any other 4th gen monster, which has mostly bars as well as a more aggressive 12 index. And that 12 is one of the few remnants of the more aggressive look from the previous generations. Part of me loves that more aggressive look from the earlier gens, but this is a bit more of a toned down casual look. The indices also have a silver polished framing, which is then filled with white luminous paint. Although, like a lot of Seiko divers, there is often a subtle green glow to the indices due to the sheer amount of lume, which helps them even further stand out from the dial. Once again, the handset used is fairly standard, and that does include a rougher brush texture. Now, in these macro shots, that rougher brush surface of the hands tends to kind of blend into the textured surface of the dial. But in real life, rest assured that is not the case. The way the brush surface catches the light helps them easily stand out from the matte finish of the dial, as well as the polished indices which reflect it in a different way. And even though at first glance you may look at this and think there's not a lot of contrast, but I've actually found it to be very readable over the last few months, where the light-colored indices stand out nicely from the darker blue at the edge of the dial. Now, you also have your standard Seiko Prospec text on the dial, which I normally think crowds the dial a bit, but here with that black text against the matte dial, I think actually looks good. Then at the very bottom, you also have a Made in Japan text. Now, this is in white, so you can easily read it against the dark blue, but it is so small that it's barely noticeable when you're wearing it. You also have a day date at the 3, and this is one change with the Generation 4 monsters. Previously, it was just a date. Now, the white date wheel does help it blend in a bit, and overall it is very helpful and functional, but the entire day date winds up crowding the dial, and just overall disrupts the flow. So if there was one change I could make to this dial design, it would be to reduce that just back to the date. Then, over at the left, just in case you haven't noticed it, you have one of the Antarctica's key design features. One that is truly unique, where there's this very small trail of penguin footprints marching up that snowy glacier, which is probably not something you were expecting if you didn't already know about it. Some are going to think this is just completely goofy and cartoonish, and I completely understand you there. But personally, I just flat out love this. It's different, and I think it really helps define the inspiration behind the design. Yet, it's also so subtle that most people won't notice it unless you point it out. So it is a little bit goofy, but it's kind of stealth goofy. Now, during the unboxing, I talked about why I really love this design and why I decided to get one. And basically, it boils down to it's something that kind of takes me back, which is sort of weird when you're talking about penguin feet. But basically, I grew up in San Diego, not too far from the SeaWorld Marine Park. So I went there a ton as a kid. Then later on as a teenager, I got a part-time job there, and lots of friends that worked there. It basically just played a big part in my life. And one of my favorite things to do there was to go to the penguin encounter. So seeing this dial and seeing those silly little penguin feet just kind of take me back and puts a smile on my face. Now, I know that's rather specific and it's not going to apply to a lot of people out there, but that is the reason I got it. And in a lot of ways, I think that really boils down what watch collecting is all about for me. Because it's not really about luxury pieces or hot horology or about having something that's going to impress other people. It's about watches that I like, ones I want to wear, and ones that have a connection or bring back a memory. But that's enough deep thoughts, let's just move on. The Antarctica monster has its share of issues, and most of them are on the QC and manufacturing front, who, honestly, I just think are phoning it in at this point. Whereas I think the design department at Seiko is on it. I think they're doing an overall fantastic job, and the design here is a prime example of that. So in a lot of ways, I think the biggest issue Seiko has right now is that their divisions aren't really talking to each other and aren't on the same page, at least in terms of performance. And that's something I think they really need to address moving forward if they want to stay competitive. However, even despite the issues here, I think the Antarctica monster is one that is filled with glorious purpose. One that is destined to become one of the more memorable monsters ever produced. One that I think will even overshadow the more recent Frost monster. And I think a large chunk of that may be due to this watch's sheer versatility, which is not necessarily something you would first think of when you look at the design. One thing I've really come to appreciate about it over the last few months is that while it never quite seems to match anything I wear perfectly, it always seems to go with everything. It's definitely a watch that stands out, but it always looks good and never clashes with anything I wear. But let's move on to the Lume, and as this is a Seiko diver, you would expect it to have good Lume. And long story short, it does. Just like any other Pro Spec diver, there's a good amount of Seiko Lumebrite throughout the dial. And in my comparison test, I found it to be on par with my Seiko Turtle. So the easiest way to describe it is that it's Seiko good. As for the movement, well, Seiko has always bounced back and forth on what they put in the monsters. But with the 4th gen monster, Seiko has decided to go with the tried and true workhorse that is the 4R36. It really is the perfect movement for any true affordable tool watch. So no real complaints about the movement itself. But, at this price of the special editions, you could easily argue that Seiko should use an upgraded 6R movement. And let's start wrapping things up by talking about value. And value here completely sucks. I don't think that's hard to see at all. As all you have to do is look at whatever a normal 4th gen monster is going for, let alone maybe some monster homages, or even some other microbrand divers out there. And then compare that to what the going rate for these are. Which also illustrates some other issues here, because other than the dial, this is identical to a regular 4th gen monster. So it very much is an affordable watch, but it's being sold at a price point above what I consider to be for an affordable watch. It also shows that rather than fix some QC issues, Seiko's more interested in making limited or special editions just to keep the money train rolling. And that's also a problem. Although, to be fair, Seiko fans, and I'm including myself in this, are just as much to blame for that as Seiko, as we keep buying them. Now, bottom line, I love this watch. It's gorgeous and just different. And I think it shows that Seiko's design team is on point, and when given the chance, they can create really beautiful and unique pieces. However, as much as I love this watch, the QC and the value part of this really holds me back from wholeheartedly recommending it. And while this shows that Seiko's design division is good to go, it also shows that their manufacturing division needs a swift kick in the ass. So my recommendation for this one is that if you like it, try to find one in person just to see it. And if you can't do that, then continue to watch more reviews and look at pictures and really think about it. Really think about the design, and if you'd still love it despite any flaws that might come along with it. And after that, if you still want one, then go for it. But what do you guys think about all this? What do you think about the Antarctica monster and just the state of Seiko in general? Let me know down below. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, you all know what to do. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.